So let me introduce myself. I'm Natalie Doyle. I'm acting director of the Monash European and EU Centre at Monash University. And it is my great pleasure to welcome you to this panel discussion that we are hosting around this really interesting and slightly provocative theme: can the Eurozone survive its crisis? It is a great pleasure to have, in fact, three prominent figures in their own world contributing to this panel discussion. First of all, the event shall be chaired by His Excellency Mr. Daly, who is Ambassador and Head of the Delegation of the European Union to Australia and New Zealand. Ambassador Daly has been the head of the European Union's delegation in Canberra since January 2009, and he has a distinguished career in the diplomatic service of the Republic of Ireland, and then in the European Union, in the European Commission. If I'm right, David, we've done quite a lot of work with the question of enlargement, and specifically Croatia's accession to the European Union. Our first speaker, before we have the discussion, is Professor Bill Mitchell, who holds the research chair in economics at Newcastle University, and he's the director of the Centre of Full Employment and Equity, or, wait for it, COFFEE. This is a wonderful name for a centre. It is an official research centre at the University of Newcastle, and it has a twin sister at the University of Maastricht in the Netherlands. So he's a very frequent visiting professor in Europe. Professor Mitchell has written many books and articles on employment, fiscal policy, and macroeconomic policy as a whole, and he has co-edited a book called Growth and Cohesion in the European Union, published in 2006, which touch upon some of the issues which I'm sure will come up in today's discussion. Our second speaker is Dr. Stefan Auer, who holds a Jean Monnet Chair in EU Interdisciplinary Studies at La Trobe University. He's a senior lecturer in history and politics. His book, Liberal Nationalism in Central Europe, won the prize for Best Book in European Studies in 2005 with the University Association for Contemporary European Studies. So this will be the three people involved in the panel discussion, including myself, of course. I would like to ask you to join me in welcoming our three guests. And I will now hand over the lecture to Professor Mitchell. And David, unless David wishes to say a few words.
So, as chairman, I say Professor Mitchell.
Okay, I wasn't actually sure, David, at one point you actually wanted to be chairing. And David, would you like to take the microphone?
Can everybody hear me okay? Thank you.
You sure? Okay.
So I'm the director of this research centre at the University of Newcastle. And like all research centres in Australia and universities these days, we're small businesses. We have to raise our own funds. Essentially, I'm the only one on the university payroll. The rest of my 8 staff are all funded through competitive research. It's a pretty tough world out there now. So Natalie asked me to provide an economic discussion about the euro crisis, and so that's what I'll endeavour to do. But first of all, do you want the lights just in here? No. This is just in the last 24 hours. This is the data we see coming out from the national statistical authorities, the Eurostats. These are just some snippets I picked up. This is employment growth in Spain by age category. You can see youngest here to the oldest in the labour force. In the last 12 months, 16 to 19-year-olds, 25% loss in employment. 25%. So that's 25, and you can calibrate it up. It's just little statistics that are coming out every day. Here's Spain. The labour force data came out on Monday, yesterday. And look at 16 to 19-year-olds, teenagers we call them in Australia. 71.5% of them who are active seeking work are unemployed. And the next group up, 20 to 24, 48%. Taken together, the youth is 52% of them are unemployed. Now, we talk a lot about the challenges of the future, the ageing society. It's a productivity challenge, and that means that we want to have everybody as skilled as possible. You do not skill your future labour force by leaving 71% of them idle. And the reason for that, this is real GDP figures came out yesterday from the Central Statistical Authority in Spain, in Madrid. This is annual real GDP growth. The red bars are quarterly, each quarter. This is the big crisis. They started coming out of it with a bit of fiscal injection. The austerity mantra hit, and they're double dipping again. Here's Greece. 50% of their 15 to 24-year-olds, 51% are unemployed, 22% of the overall labour force are unemployed, and this is tracing the rise in that as the EU elites impose austerity onto these countries. This came out this morning. This is retail sales. The blue bars, this is real GDP growth, very strong relationship as you'd expect. Spending creates income, creates output, and in the latest figures that came out, retail sales dropped 13%. Now, if we transpose that into our economy here, a 13% drop in retail sales would be an absolute disaster. An annual decline in retail sales, we would consider that an absolute disaster. Someone said to me today, jokingly, at least you won't have much trouble buying anything, there won't be much competition. Today's Eurostat front page, I just took a snapshot. Household saving up to 13.7%, business investment rate down to 20.7%. So I make this little quip here, no Ricardians in sight. One of the things that my profession disgracefully has imposed upon this debate is this notion of Ricardian equivalence. I'll explain it briefly in a moment. But basically, these things should be, household savings should be way down and business investment should be way up if the justification for fiscal austerity was valid. And we see this data right across the zone. We're seeing it in Britain at the moment. And the latest ILO report that came out yesterday, they've got this social unrest index, and that's rising dramatically everywhere where employment is falling off a cliff. And I just saw this picture today, which I thought was interesting. Spanish speakers will understand. It means Thieves. And this is one of the biggest banks in Spain. So we're seeing a breakdown of social stability occurring right across Europe as their labour markets decline rapidly. So what I want to talk about briefly is give you a general overview of what the crisis is about. And this is non-Eurozone specific, but it helps you to understand the Eurozone dilemma. I want to talk a little bit about monetary systems, so we get a bit pointy here, but not too pointy. And then I'll give a brief history of the Eurozone and why it got to this situation. I'll talk a bit about the so-called German solution, the period that they call the stability period. This was the period of what I call German austerity. And then I'll talk about the way in which the crisis has exposed the intrinsic design flaws of the Eurozone, which makes it unworkable and which leads me to conclude it should be dismantled, preferably in an orderly manner, but that's unlikely to happen because of the obstinate nature of the political processes in Europe. And I'll talk about the various responses to the crisis very briefly and explain why they failed, and then we'll just juxtapose the alternatives. One thing to understand is that this particular recession that the world's been trapped in more or less since late 2007 is a very specific type of recession. It's called what we call a balance sheet recession. And that is that it originates in the financial sector and then spills over into what we call the real economy, the production sector. Most recessions begin in the real economy and end in the real economy. They mostly originate from flighty expectations from private investors, that is, not people investing in financial assets, but people investing in productive capital, and they get pessimistic, they cut investments quite cyclical, quite erratic, and they cut their investment spending. The economy goes into a downturn, it's sometimes very sharp, very deep, but often not so deep and not so sharp, and relatively quickly that comes out again. It's not to say they're not big problems, but they are typically of relatively short duration, and they have this V shape. The downturn and recovery is pretty symmetric, and what's asymmetric is the response of the labour market to a typical recession. But they're relatively short-lived, and they're relatively easy to stimulate out of. A balance sheet recession involves the unsustainability of private sector balance sheets. And the problem then is, in other words, there's too much private debt build-up. And the problem then is that you can't get any sustained recovery in the private sector until the balance sheets are sorted out. And that requires sustained saving. The modern terminology is deleveraging. And that's a very long, drawn-out, painful process. And those data I talked about, saving ratio rising, that's part of this deleveraging that's going on. And what I can tell you about balance sheet recessions, they're very rare, but what they need is sustained government support in the form of continuous deficits to support the income generating process, which supports the private sector deleveraging process, which allows the balance sheets to restore back to sustainable levels and get the debt back down. And that's the unique nature of this particular thing. Now, why did this come to pass? We've got to go back a couple of decades. It didn't just happen in 2007. And what I argue here is that since variously 1980s, we'll just say, but some a bit earlier, a bit later, we had a change in economic paradigm, and it's now popularly known as neoliberalism, and this led to pressure on the policymakers to introduce a series of policy changes which really ultimately allowed the inherent destructive dynamics of the capital system to play out. And the sort of things I'm talking about, we started to, for many years, like 84 years out of the years since 1930, the US government's run continuous budget deficits. Budget deficits were the norm in Australia, in all advanced countries, because they were needed to support growth, to support non-government saving. And the neoliberal paradigm is characterised by this demonisation of budget deficits. And so we started to get this budget austerity. And this year we had 10 out of 11 years from 1996 of budget surpluses. And we were told they were good. We weren't told about the degradation of the public infrastructure and the loss of the training facilities from privatising our public enterprises and the rest of it. The other thing was we had massive deregulation variously in different countries and different types and different characteristics of the deregulation of our labour and financial markets. And I'll explain what happened about that. And the deregulation of the labour markets allowed a massive redistribution of national income towards profits. So in Australia, for example, the wage share in national income in 1985 was about 60%, 59, 60%. It's about 51% now. That's real income going towards profits away from workers. And what that meant was that previously real wages had grown in Australia. Real wages are the purchasing power of the wages that are paid, and productivity is the output per unit of head that the workers are producing. Previously, those two things grew together. And that made sense if you think about it, because the growth in the purchasing power was in proportion with the increasing capacity of the economy to pump out goods and services per head. And so consumption is the largest part of national expenditure. And so it made sense to keep that growing together. And since the 1980s, we've had a massive divergence in most countries between real wages growth, which has been, in some countries, virtually zero, in Australia, very small, and productivity growth continued to grow up, and there's been this big wedge, which has been redistributed to profits, and that gave the financial markets, which were increasingly deregulated and allowed to do things that we previously hadn't allowed them to do for reasons relating to financial stability, that gave them the largesse to then create the derivative products. And what it also meant was the way to overcome realisation crisis. If you're not paying workers very much over time, yet they're producing more and more, how do you get them to consume the goods and services? Well, the financial markets found the clue. We had this massive rise in credit growth, this financial engineering era. You know, you can remember the stories, children getting $20,000 credit cards in the mail. And so eventually that was going to be an unsustainable growth strategy, and that's the nature of the origins of the crisis. Prior to that period, which I call the full employment period, we had a commitment by our governments to maintain full employment. And they had a series of public institutions that mediated the tension between what I call the social settlement, that's where people want to live and do live, and the economic settlement, that's where firms locate and produce jobs. And that's always moving, it's a very dynamic process, and governments were there to mediate that and to make sure there were enough jobs, and you could always get a job in Australia, in the advanced countries. And fiscal policy was used to make sure total spending in the economy was sufficient to maintain enough spending to maintain the jobs that people desired. And during this period, budget deficits were the norm, and private sector overall saving was also the norm. And so this last short period of history, where the governments have tried and actually have been able to get into surplus, and the private sector has been increasingly getting into debt overall, that's a very atypical period in the history of our systems, our monetary systems. And so when you hear our Treasurer say we've got to get back into surplus, well, he's saying we've got to get back into this atypical period, which was part of the problem. Now, all of that commitment to full employment, as I said, broke down in the mid-70s and a bit after that, and it was based upon this idea that the private markets will self-regulate, and if they're left to self-regulate, they will deliver optimal outcomes, they will wealth maximise. And that was the mantra. And my profession is responsible for that mantra, unfortunately. And the features of it were that the government abandoned its commitment to full employment. So in the 1945 to about 1975, the government always made sure there were enough jobs for people to have. Right down to the most disadvantaged worker, right down to the alcoholic, the schizophrenic, the criminals, the layabouts, they all could get jobs, and they all did. They abandoned that. In Australia, we brought in this fancy thing called full employability, where the government's responsibility was only to make sure people were ready for work, not that there was any work there. There was an accelerated deregulation. There was this massive growth of the financial sector. There was the privatisations all through the Western world where there was public enterprise. And the notion of the collective, which defined the full employment period, that we basically believed there was a society, that we believed that some people were going to be disadvantaged for various reasons, sometimes their own fault, sometimes not, but we believed that as a collective we would look after all of us. And that was, the government was our agent to make sure that we got the train going as fast as we could, but we didn't leave an increasing proportion of people on the station behind. And this was replaced in this neoliberal period by everything was individual. Unemployed were individual because they were lazy, they had bad attitudes, and they weren't sufficiently enterprising. Everything was related back to the individual. So if it's an individual problem, then why do we want the state to intervene to mediate it? Well, we don't, so let's get the state out of our lives. And, you know, Maggie Thatcher said the famous thing, there was no such thing as society. And this is when we bought this line that the budget deficits were basically evil, they were satanic constructs, and we had to discipline governments and bring in all sorts of machinery to stop governments running budget deficits, which we did. We changed ways in which debt was issued, we reorganised treasury operations, etc. We put certain constraints on central banks. And there was this idea that if we just leave the private sector go, and the financial markets will allocate all of this resources in an efficient, optimal way, and we'll all be better off. Now I get to Europe a bit, because here we enter what I call the European eccentricity. And the Europeans took all of that ideology, all of that neoliberal endeavour, and then they put their own unique stamp on it. And what they did was they conspired against the wishes of the citizens of most of their countries to introduce the European Monetary Union. They accompanied it with this thing called the Stability and Growth Pact, and it only became the Growth Pact as a consequence of the French insisted. The Germans wanted to call it just the Stability Pact without the growth. And this was an even more rigid and damaging neoliberal construction than the rest of the advanced world adopted. And what I'll argue in the next part of the talk is that it's actually the existence of the euro that's the problem. It's the existence of the euro. It's the euro that's the problem. It's the monetary system that's the problem. And it can't be fixed in its present form. So by imposing austerity, by having bailout funds, by having structural adjustment programs, you're not going to fix the problem. The problem is intrinsic to the design of the monetary system. So let me try to explain that. Most people don't understand that even in this country we've had two very different types of monetary systems over the last 70 years. Up to 1971, we had a sort of a gold standard, then it became a US dollar converted standard, of fixed exchange rates, convertibility back into gold via the US dollar, and that was abandoned in 1971. And most of the current body of mainstream macroeconomic theory still thinks we've got a gold standard, where governments were spending was constrained, central banks had to compromise monetary policy to defend the fixed exchange rate, and that governments had to issue debt and tax to raise the resources to spend. That was the convertible currency system. Well, President Nixon did one good thing in his presidency, and that was it, to abandon it. And in 1970, we didn't abandon it straight away, but eventually we did also. And most of the world adopted what are called fiat currency systems. Now, what the European Union did, the European Monetary Union did, was to build an eccentric mix incorporating the worst of both. So I'll explain that. Very briefly, a fiat currency system like it operates in Australia, not as the Treasurer will tell you it operates, but like the intrinsic nature of our monetary system. A monetary system is about how currency is issued and the options and constraints that imposes upon government. In a fiat currency system, which the majority of the world now operates with, the government is the monopoly issuer of the currency. And I talk about the government here as a consolidated entity between the Treasury function and the central bank function. Even though there's all this neoliberal flim-flam that the central bank is some way independent of the Treasury. Well, that's not exactly true. Even in a daily funds management type arrangement, that's not true, definitely. There's talk going on every day between Treasury and the central bank to manage the cash system, the liquidity system, but that's a separate topic. The currency has no intrinsic value, it's just bits of paper, unlike the old commodity-based systems, which were gold and silver, they had intrinsic value. And if those old enough will remember when we introduced the decimal currency here, there was a 50-cent coin issued, and it suddenly disappeared from circulation, and they worked out that it was made out of, I think, silver, some sort of silver, and it was worth face value 63 cents. And so people got it, melted it, sold it. So a fiat currency has no intrinsic value, and the way in which a government makes that currency have value, forces us to use it, is by declaring all tax obligations in that currency. We have to get the currency, and therefore we have to accept government spending so that we can stay solvent in the tax system. In a fiat currency system, the central bank sets the short-term interest rate and conditions all of the longer-term interest rates, and the central bank can condition all yields in the economy if it wants to at each maturity segment, 5 year through 10 year, if it wants to, under a fiat currency. And the other important thing is the currency floats on international markets, and what that means is that the government is no longer compromised in its domestic policy by the need to defend a fixed exchange rate. It can allow the exchange rate to adjust to external imbalances and get on with the life of maintaining public purpose within the domestic economy. The other thing to note, and I think our former RBA governor said this last night on the ABC, that the government in a fiat currency system like Australia and the US, like Japan, like the UK, like almost everywhere, is not revenue constrained. That means it can spend whenever it likes, whenever there's something for sale. In Australian dollars, our government can buy it. Now, that's not to say that it should spend X amount. There's a strict amount in which a fiat currency issuing government should spend, but the government can never run out of money. The government in a fiat currency system is not like a household. For those old enough, you'll remember Prime Minister Fraser went on ABC TV one night and gave us a lecture on, it was in the 70s, on the economic matters, and he said, what we've all got to understand is that the Australian government's like a big household. Well, no, it's not. A household uses the currency, the federal government issues the currency. That's two fundamentally different things and two fundamentally different constraints. Now, how much should a government spend? Well, typically the non-government sector desires to save for a number of reasons. And so that unspent income that's circulating in the economy, if it's not re-spent, will lead firms to build up inventories and start to lay off workers. And the only way you can avoid the economy going into a downward spiral is to make sure the government fills that spending gap. And that's the nature of the budget deficit. And that's why we've virtually always in our history run both small, continuous budget deficits to provide the aggregate demand support for producers and at the same time allow the non-government sector to save. Saving takes out spending. So a government in this sort of monetary system has two choices. It can either fill that spending gap and maintain full employment, or it can leave some slack, try to run budget surpluses if it can, and create a scenario of persistent underemployment and unemployment. The Australian government has more or less been pursuing this option for about 30 years. We have not had true full employment for 30 years, or more, 35 or something like that. And this leads to an understanding of what a good and a bad deficit is. This is vital in understanding the Euro situation, because a good deficit is when the government fills the spending gap, runs a small deficit, fluctuates according to the nature of private sector spending and saving, and runs that deficit to make sure there's good public infrastructure, good public services, incentives to the private sector to produce and to be efficient, and also there's full employment. A bad deficit is one where they try to run a surplus when the private sector is unwilling to spend and trying to save, and as a consequence of the austerity, they cause a recession which then undermines their tax base. And so there's this concept in economics called automatic stabilisers. They're built into the business cycle. So when the Australian economy is growing strongly, tax revenue is going to be stronger for a given set of tax rates than when the Australian economy is tanking. Just look at what's happening to revenue now because our economy is slowing down. Now, if a government in that situation tries to impose austerity, well, then it just worsens the thing because the private sector are not willing to spend, and that spending gap is just growing and growing as the government withdraws its spending support. And so you end up getting a bad deficit because of these automatic stabilisers, the loss of tax revenue, and in some countries the increased welfare payments because of the unemployment. And why are they bad deficits? Because you've got high unemployment, stagnant production, falling retail sales, increasing poverty rates, and you've still got a deficit.